All right, class, today we are learning how to use the midpoint and the distance formula. We're going to start with the midpoint formula because it's easier. So, vamos a empezar con la midpoint formula porque es más fácil. For the midpoint formula, all you have to do is add and divide. Para esta fórmula, solo tienes que sumar y dividir. So, let's begin. The midpoint formula looks like this. x1 plus x2 divided by 2. y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So this is our midpoint formula. And so the best thing to do to begin using the midpoint formula or either formula is to label your points. And so here we have a point, -4, 2, and we have another point, 2, 6. And so we're going to label this x1, y1 because we have an x and a y coordinate. And we're going to label this one x2, y2. And now we're going to plug into our formula. Our formula says we're going to do x1 first. So what is our x1 value? Our x1 value is -4 plus x2. What's our x2 value? That's a 2 divided by 2. And now we're going to take our y1, and our y1 is 2 plus our y2, which is 6, and divide by 2. So let's crunch these numbers. What is -4 plus 2? That would be -2. -2 over 2, and we have 2 plus 6. 2 plus 6 is 8 over 2. And so now let's crunch these numbers even further. What is -2 divided by 2? That would be -1. And 8 divided by 2 is 4. So what is the midpoint of the points above? It is -1, 4. And let's graph that point. So the point -1 up 1, 2, 3, 4 is right here. And now I'm going to draw a segment connecting our 2 points. Go ahead and use the edge of your ID or a note card to go do that. And this is our midpoint M. And M is exactly in the middle of this segment, so we can add tick marks here and here to show that. So, given the following endpoints, S and T, find the midpoint. No problem. Let's rewrite our midpoint formula. x1 plus x2 divided by 2. y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And now let's plug into our formula. Before we can plug into our formula, what do we need to do? We need to label our points. So let's let S be x1, y1, and T to be x2, y2. So what is our x1? -2. Plus what's our x2? 4. What is our y1? Our y1 is 4. Plus what's our y2? 2 divided by 2. And now it's time to crunch these numbers. -2 plus 4 is +2. And then 4 plus 2 is 6. And where's our midpoint? Our midpoint is at 1, 3. right. We're going to do it again. The endpoints of AB are 1, 2, and 7, 8. Find the coordinate of midpoint M. And so we have our formula right here. Let's label our points. We're going to let A be x1, y1, and we're going to let B be x2, y2. So our x1 is 1, our x2 is 7, our y1 is 2, and our y2 is 8. And so we're going to calculate our numbers. And so 1 plus 7 is 8 over 2. And then we have 2 plus 8 is 10 over 2. Where is our midpoint? Our midpoint is at 4, 5. Go ahead and flip your paper over to the back, and we're going to continue. Where's the midpoint of the segment? So before we can determine where the midpoint is using our midpoint formula, we are going to tell the coordinates of each point. And so our first point is at -5, -2. Our second point is at -1, 4. Let's go ahead and label our points. And so to label our points, we are going to label 1, x1, y1, and label the other one x2, y2. So let's let -5, -2 be our x1, y1, and -1, 4 be our x2, y2. And so now we have to remember, what is our midpoint formula? Our midpoint formula is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And so our x1 is -5, our x2 is -1 divided by 2, and our y1 is -2, and our y2 is 4. Let's calculate our numbers. -5 plus -1 is -6. And -2 plus 4 is 2. And we end up with -3, 1. Let's graph our point and see if it looks like it's in the middle. -3, 1. And here on this segment, -3, 1 is precisely in the middle. Let's move on to our last midpoint problem. Where's the midpoint of QP if Q is at 1, 8 and P is at 3, 12? Let's label our points: x1, y1, x2, y2. Our formula we can see above, so we're just going to plug into it. Our x1 is 1, plus our x2 is 3, divided by 2. Our y1 is 8, plus our y2 is 12, divided by 2. Because we're dividing by 2, I want you to know that sometimes it's okay if you get a decimal or a fraction. So let's continue. 1 plus 3 is 4, divided by 2. 8 plus 12 is 20, divided by 2. Our midpoint is at the coordinate 2, 10. All right, so let's go back and figure out the distance formula. How do we use the distance formula? So the distance formula is very different. First, we have this square root symbol. So we have a square root symbol, and inside the square root, we have x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So we're doing a lot in this. We're squaring, we're adding, we're subtracting, and we're taking the square root. So that's why we save that for a second. Find the distance between the points above. Luckily, we've already labeled our points. We have x1, y1, x2, y2. And so all we have to do is take those points and plug them into our formula. So our x2 is 2. Minus our x1, which is negative 4. We'll fix that in a second. Plus y2, our y2 is 6. Minus our y1, which is 2. Squared. So right here we have minus a negative. So what happens when we have a double minus? That turns into a plus. And so now let's calculate a little bit further. We have 2 plus 4, which is 6 squared, plus 6 minus 2. 6 minus 2 is 4 squared. And so squaring is not multiplying by 2, it's multiplying by itself. So 6 squared is 6 times 6, which is 36. And 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is 16. And 36 plus 16 is 52. And so the distance between these 2 points is the square root of 52. And so when we put the square root of 52 in our calculator, we're going to get a decimal, and we're going to round that decimal to 2 decimal places. So the square root of 52 is 7.21 units. And I will show you that in the calculator right here. Square root of 52 is 7.21 units. All right, find the distance between these 2 points. So our distance formula, let's rewrite it. Our distance formula is x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared, and then we take the square root. And so first thing we need to do is label our points. We're going to let our first point be x1, y1, and our second point be x2, y2. And in this formula, x2 comes first. So our x2 is negative 2. Our formula says we have to subtract, so we're going to go minus what? Our x1, which is 2, squared, plus y2, and our y2 is negative 1, plus, not plus, minus y1, which is negative 1, squared. So again, we have a double minus. What happens when we have a double minus? That turns into a plus. Let's move on. -2 minus 2 is -4 squared, plus -1 plus 1 is 0 squared. Anytime we square a negative number, it's going to turn positive, because here we have -4 times -4, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So you have the square root of 16 plus 0, and so it's just 16. And what is the square root of 16? The square root of 16 is 4. The distance between these 2 points is 4 units. All right. And so before we move on, let's go ahead and jot down a little note. Squaring a negative becomes positive. All right. Now, find xy. So here we have xy without a bar. So that means they want to know how long is xy. Given that x is at -3/6 and y is at 2, -4. So if we want to know how long a segment is, that means we want to know the distance between the endpoints. That's going to tell us the length of that segment. And so we're going to use the distance formula. First, when we use the distance formula, the first thing we need to do is label our points. So here we have x1, y1, and here we have x2, y2. We can see our formula above, so we're just going to plug in right here. x2 comes first. We want the square root of, let's put that more to the side, of x2, which is 2, minus x1, which is -3, squared, plus y2, which is -4, minus y1, which is 6, squared. And so, again, we have a double minus, negative, that's going to turn to plus, and 2 plus 3 is 5. And -4 minus 6 is -10. 5 squared is 5 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. And -10 times -10 is positive 100. And so 25 plus 100 is the square root of 125. And we're going to put that in our calculator. To find that the length of xy, that xy is 11.18 units. Let's move on to the back. Find TR. So the length of TR, which is the distance between T and R. First thing we're going to do is label our points. x1, y1, x2, y2. And so our formula says x2, which is 3, minus x1, which is -4, plus y2, which is 2, minus y1, which is 3, squared. And let's calculate our numbers. We have a double negative. Double negative is going to turn into a positive right there. And so right here we have 3 plus 4 is 7 squared, plus 3 plus 2 minus 3, and 2 minus 3 is negative 1 squared. 7 squared is 49. And negative 1 squared is simply 1. And so we have the square root of 50. And that means that TR is, let's figure out what is the square root of 50. 7.07 units long. All right, find EF given that E is at 2, negative 12, and F is at 7, 0. All right, let's label our points. X1, Y1, X2, Y2. In the distance formula, X2 comes first, so we have 7 minus X1, which is 2, squared, plus Y2, which is 0, minus negative 12, all right, we have a double negative. What does that mean? It means that's going to turn positive. And so 7 minus 2 is 5 squared, plus 12 squared. 5 squared is 25, and 12 squared is 144. Not 14, 144. And 25 plus 144 is 169. We take the square root of 169 and we find that EF is 13 units long. So our last thing that we're going to do today is find an endpoint. And so I is the midpoint of TN. Let's draw a picture. We have T, we have N, and I is the midpoint. Given that T is at 1, 7, and I is at negative 2, 10, find the other endpoint N. And so there's lots of ways that we can do this, but this is the best way I've found to do this. We can use the midpoint formula to help us, or we can just problem solve it out. So here's how we problem solve it out. T, we're going to put our x's on top, our y's on bottom. All right, so we have x, y. T is at 1, 7. I is at negative 2, 10. And so we're going to think, how far did we have to travel to get halfway? How far did we have to travel to get from positive 1 to negative 2? We had to go down 3. So if we want to go the whole way, we're going to have to go down another 3. Negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5. And so to get from 7 to 10, how far do you have to travel? You have to travel up 3 to get halfway. Because I is halfway, it's the midpoint. And so if we want to go the whole way, we have to go another plus 3, which makes us land at 10 plus 3, 13. So N point N, x's are on top, is at negative 5, 13. All right, let's do that again. Given endpoint B and midpoint U, find endpoint N. Let's draw a picture. We have endpoint B, midpoint U, find endpoint N. So U is a midpoint. Two tick marks to show it. B is at 6, 8. U is at 4, 10. We're going to think, how far did we travel to go halfway? To get from 6 to 4, we go -2. And so if we want to go the whole way, we're going to go another -2. 4 minus 2 is 2. And to get from 8 to 10, we go +2. So if we want to go the whole way, we have to go another +2. And 10 plus 2 is 12. And so endpoint N is at 2, 12. Now, for our last problem, I'm going to show you how to do this using the midpoint formula. All right? So, we're still going to draw a picture. We have endpoint L, midpoint U, and endpoint V that we need to find. Endpoint L, midpoint U, and endpoint V that we need to find. If U is a midpoint, we need tick marks. So, our midpoint formula says x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And so what we have is L is our x1, y1. And V is our x2, y2. But we don't know what our x2, y2 is, so we can plug into our formula. We know that the midpoint, that this result ends up being -2. So we have to ask ourselves, 2 plus x2 divided by 2 equals -2. And this is an equation we can solve. To solve it, we're going to multiply by 2 on both sides. And so these cancel out, and we're left with 2 plus x2 equals -4. Subtract 2 from both sides, and we find that x2 is -6. And so V is at -6. We still don't know the y coordinate. Let's find it. And so we know that y1 is 5. 5 plus y2 divided by 2 is going to equal 7. How do we know it equals 7? Because 7 is the y coordinate of the midpoint. And so now we solve this equation by doing the exact same thing we just did. First, we're going to start by multiplying by 2 on both sides. We end up with 5 plus y2 equals 14. Now we need to subtract 5 on both sides. And we find that y2 equals 9. So, 2 ways to do it. You can use the midpoint formula to help you find an endpoint, or you can use your problem-solving picture to help you find an endpoint, okay? Thank you so much for doing your notes with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.